Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's CMM Insights webinar in association with the National Care Forum. Thank you for joining us to discuss the impact of the additional financial pressures facing care and support providers as a result of government's autumn budget. We'll be diving into these as well as exploring how the sector is moving forwards in spite of them. We've got some brilliant speakers joining us today, so I'm looking forward to hearing how the discussions will progress. We really encourage you to ask questions throughout the session, which you can do by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please bear with us as we respond to those, and any that we don't get to, we'll endeavour to answer directly to you after the session. The webinar will be recorded and will be available to view on the CMM website next week. It's now time to hand over to Liz Jones, Policy Director at the National Care Forum, who will be chairing the webinar, along with our speakers who will introduce themselves and get the conversation started.
Thank you, Henry, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on our webinar. It's great to see so many of you in the audience. So my name's Liz Jones. I'm the Policy Director here at the National Care Forum. We're a membership organisation for not-for-profit providers of care and support. And we work very closely with Care Management Matters, bringing kind of range of hot topics to discuss at the webinars that they very kindly organise and host for us. And I'm pretty sure that most of you will think there isn't really a hotter topic at the moment than that of the fallout of the autumn budget, particularly in terms of the measures that the government's brought in relation to the employer national insurance contribution regime, both the increase in the overall rate, but very significantly the broadening of the thresholds. So we have got a selection of folks on the call, and I am going to just ask them to all introduce themselves before we move into the different contributions that our speakers are bringing to the discussion. And we've got a little bit of a running order, but of course, while you're listening to what our speakers have got to say, if you've got questions that you, or thoughts that you would like to put in the chat or in the Q&A, then please do that while they occur to you. If you're anything like me, you're listening to people and you think, oh, I just want to ask them this, or oh, that reminds me of that. If you've got specific questions, we'll try and answer them. We may not know everything, but we'll give it our best shot. So I'm going to just go round our speakers and ask them to introduce themselves, and I'll do it in the order that they're going to make their contributions today. So first of all, Natasha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Liz. Hi, yeah, I'm Natasha Curry. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy at the Nuffield Trust, which is an independent think tank and unrelated to any other Nuffields, just to make that clear. And I'm going to be giving a bit of an intro to what we heard in the budget and other policy developments coming up.
Thank you, Natasha. And if you haven't seen it, the Nuffield Trust did some really helpful analysis of the impact of the budget. So who better than Natasha to come and talk to us about that in more detail? So next up, we'll have Oona.
Hi, I'm Oona Goldsworthy. I'm Chief Executive of Brunelcare. We're a not-for-profit charity working on housing and care in the Bristol area.
Thanks, Oona. Then we've got Jim.
Hi everybody, I'm Jim Kane. I'm the Chief Executive of a charity called Community Integrated Care, which provides supported living services for around about 2,500 people with learning disabilities, autism and mental health conditions.
Thank you, Jim. And then we'll have Mel.
Good afternoon. So my name is Mel Locke. I'm the Executive Director of Adult Social Care and Housing and the ADASS in Somerset. But I also have a role for ADASS as a co-chair of their use of resources. So hopefully we can have a little conversation about both those areas.
Fantastic. And thank you all very much for giving up your time to come and talk to us today and bringing your expertise. So I think we will get started. So I'm going to hand to Natasha, who's going to tell us some more about the really helpful analysis that the Nuffield Trust did of the budget, and also just to help us kind of place that in the broader context of what is a very active policy agenda that the government has at the moment. So there's quite a lot of things to juggle alongside thinking about how we respond to what the budget has brought us. And Natasha's got some slides, so she's going to talk us through the work they've done and some other considerations. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Liz. Can everyone see my slides? Excellent. That's a good start.
Yep.
Okay. Right. I've put in the chat. Hopefully you can see a link to the piece that we did that Liz has referred to if you want to get into some more detail. But I'm going to be talking about what was announced in the budget, some modelling we did about the likely financial impact on the sector, and then just to flag a few other developments that might be of interest. Let me see if I can get the slides to move on. So what did the government announce in the budget in November? So measures that will be kicking in from April this year. There were two main sort of measures that will increase the cost of delivering care, and then one measure that intended to mitigate those costs somewhat. So I'm sure these will be familiar to most of you, but just to run through, the most significant measure introduced in the budget was around employer national insurance contributions. And that came in two parts. So an increased rate by 1.2 percentage points from 13.8% to 15%, and a reduction in the threshold of earnings at which employers need to pay their contributions of national insurance for each employee from 9,100 to 5,000. So what that means essentially is that not only will the staff that you're already paying national insurance contributions, you'll be paying a higher rate for them. The lowering of the threshold mean that more staff will be drawn into that national insurance contribution, which I think will have quite a significant impact on the sector. This is a sector that's made up of a lot of low-paid part-time workers, who a lot of whom will have been under that £9,100 threshold before. The other main sort of cost increase measure that was introduced was a change to the minimum wage from April, and that will be a 6.7% increase in the national living wage. So that's the wage for over 21s, and then a 16% increase in minimum wage for under 21s. So I think the increase in the national living wage was probably more expected, and the 6.7% is slightly lower than the last couple of years, where it's been around 10%. The larger increase in the minimum wage for younger workers of 16% is part of the government's overall ambition to create one single minimum wage for everybody. So that's a kind of alignment. And I think, obviously, this is a huge workforce. I think there are very few under 21s. So the main impact will be felt around the 6.7% in the national living wage. So those were the two main measures in terms of cost increases. The mitigation that was also introduced alongside was an increase in the employment allowance that was made more generous. So each employer at the moment has £5,000 worth of allowance towards their national insurance contribution bill. That's rising to 10,500. So it's been made more generous. They've also widened the eligibility. So before there was there was a sort of cut-off when only smaller employers were able to claim that allowance, and that sort of eligibility has been widened. So there is some mitigation of costs. So what does that mean for the sector as a whole? Well, we did some modelling to try and understand what it means in terms of the scale of the likely cost falling on the sector. And we looked at both the change to the national living wage and the national insurance contributions. And we estimate that, and we had to make a lot of assumptions around the workforce. So we had to make assumptions about average pay, the balance of full-time and part-time. So this is a sort of estimate based on those assumptions. But when we made those assumptions, we think that the national living wage increase will cost the independent, so non-public sector providers around £1.85 billion in additional wage bill in the next financial year. Then the national insurance changes, we applied that to the new wage rates, and we estimate the additional cost next year of that bill being around 940 million. So we're looking at a combined impact on the independent sector providers of 2.8 billion in total. So then we thought, well, what does that mean in terms of local authority fees? So if we assume that around 70% of all care is commissioned by local authorities, obviously that's very variable, but if we assume it's around 70%, and if we assume local authorities increase their fees to cover the full cost of care, they will need to be spending an additional £2 billion on care commissioning. So then in this green box, looking at, well, what did the government introduce in terms of additional funding for social care in the budget, and then the provisional local government finance settlement. We're looking at an £880 million increase in the grant. So that's specifically for social care going to councils, but that has to be shared with social care, children's social care. We think about 60% of that will be spent on adult social care. Councils also are able to raise money through the adult social care precept, around 650 million. So we're looking at an envelope of 1.2 billion pounds for adult social care. Obviously, councils can also raise additional money through council tax, but that's spread across all other services. And then in the financial settlement, there was also an extra 550 million of additional funding for local authority national insurance contributions. Now, the wording around that was that it was intended for use for mainly to cover local authority employee bills, but could be used for commission services. So there are choices to be made by councils around how they allocate that. The link at the bottom, which we can send around later, is a link to the full analysis that we've done if you want to see the assumptions and our methods in full. But the message here, I think, is that we clearly have an imbalance between what's going in and the likely increase in cost pressures. So and we'll hear in a moment from our colleagues on the panel around what that means in terms of decisions councils will make and the impact on providers. Before we go to that discussion, I want to just touch on a few other things that are happening in the policy space that have implications for the sector, but are not yet costed fully. So we are seeing quite a radical change in terms of wider employment policy. We're seeing employment rights being bolstered through the Employment Rights Bill, which is making its way through Parliament at the moment. So we're not sure of the timeline for that kicking in, probably wouldn't be till next financial year. But it will have implications for the sector. So that includes things like a right to guaranteed hours, right to request flexible hours, and day one rights around statutory sick pay, and the consultation of the rate of sick pay as well. So that is likely to add to the cost of employment. Obviously, these measures are really important and very valuable in terms of being able to recruit and retain valuable staff, but has to be set against the reality of this sector being very reliant on 0 hours contracts and with a largely low paid staff group. The other part of the Employment Rights Bill is set to usher in a fair pay agreement for social care. This will involve establishing a negotiating body for pay and wider terms and conditions, and then a Fair Work agency to enforce rights and agreement and rights. That's a bit further down the track. The timeline for that is likely to be a bit longer, but obviously will pave the way for greater sort of wage negotiation in this sector. And then lastly, on the horizon, there's a few developments coming down the track. So more immediately, the comprehensive spending review, which is billed for spring, not sure what that means, May, maybe June. I've put a link here to where providers or other organisations can make representations to that. We encourage you to look at that. But then beyond that, obviously we've had the announcement of the Casey Commission. I've put binoculars and a telescope there, depending on how optimistic you feel about how immediately that will produce results. But that's set up in 2 phases. The first phase looking at immediate recommendations, set to report in 2026. and then longer term reform not until 2028. We've not yet seen the terms of reference yet, so we don't know what falls in that immediate category and what's playful. But I would encourage you to think about submitting your thoughts to the comprehensive spending review, because essentially this spending review, I think, will set the envelope that will be available to the sector to implement any recommendations from at least that first phase of the Casey Commission. So Liz, I think I'll stop there and hear from other speakers, but hopefully that sets us up with a bit of context for the discussion going forward.
Super, thank
Am
you.
I still sharing?
Oh, I can see a list of presentations.
Ah, hang on a minute. Stop sharing.
Oh, oh, that was so helpful. I presume you're happy for us to make the slides available.
Yes,
Natasha,
of course.
is that
Yes,
okay?
you already have them, so happy for those to be circulated.
Brilliant. That is probably the simplest explanation I've seen of the conundrum, to be honest. So really helpful. I'll bring colleagues in just for some observations in a minute, but a couple of things I just wanted to say, prompted by your wider points. So the spending review, the deadline for telling the Treasury what you would like them to understand about decisions they're going to make in the spending review is, I think, the 9th of February.
That's right, yeah, the 9th. So it's not far off.
No. So is that a Sunday?
I think
it's a Sunday. I think it's a week on Sunday. So we are certainly in the National Care Forum. We're just doing a little bit of work to share some headlines with our members to suggest some things they might want to say in response to that opportunity. I think we're of the view that a volume of responses to the spending review are valuable alongside a degree of consistency of message. I'm reasonably confident that lots of people listening to the webinar will be of the view that the employer national insurance contribution changes are very, very difficult for the sector if you put them alongside the money that has so far been allocated to local authorities. So to try and meet those costs. So the bottom line is that we think the costs will be much higher than the amount of money allocated to local authorities to meet them. So we're going to explore that.
The other
Natasha.
thing, Liz, I should have said also is our calculations assume no change to the workforce. So no increase in the workforce, no change to, services delivered, no expansion. So just to make that clear that this is sort of,
status quo.
Status quo. Yep.
Yeah. Yes. And I think it's a really good point around the Employer Rights Bill, because certainly I know that we are all quite passionate about improving the pay terms and conditions of our workforce. And collectively as a sector, we've been campaigning on that quite a long time. Last year, there was some great work coordinated by Skills for Care to create a sector-wide workforce strategy that was kind of made with the sector, by the sector, for the sector. And the government could quite easily think about adopting that, for example, because it had a lot of buy-in. So it's not that we don't want to see better rights and better pay for our workforce. It's just that we're very nervous about having something put into statute and legislation that doesn't have a commensurate funding envelope with it, given the point you made, Natasha, about, probably at least 70% of care being paid for by the state. But also, people who pay for their own care do not have limitless pots of money here. So I think that's a really good reminder that this comes in the context of quite a complicated, pretty dynamically evolving policy environment for us. So Oona or Jim, anything you want to comment on just listening to Natasha?
If I could just add a bit around the importance of the spending review, I think in the Casey Commission. I had the I suppose good fortune of hearing the Minister for Care speak earlier this month around the Casey Commission, and he made it quite clear in that meeting that phase one was around improving the use of existing resources, and that would report in 26. And really, answers on funding may not come until the report in 28. And I think in that context, my biggest worry is that the Casey Commission will provide recommendations for a sector that no longer exists in a form capable of accepting those recommendations. So influencing the spending review, I think, is our best and possibly only chance of making meaningful change in the short term.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I guess, I mean, there's been quite a lot of reaction across the sector about the length of that timescale, hasn't there? And the fact that, you know, 2028 is A, quite a long time away, and B, much closer to the next election than this year or next year. And so it feels like the opportunity of a large majority that the government currently has is that opportunity is stronger earlier in its parliamentary term, and its kind of potency and power reduces as we get closer to the next election. So whilst we might have a really great national consensus on what we would like the shape and resourcing of social care to look like, there is a risk that that is too close to the next election for it to be meaningfully implemented. So that point about the spending review now, obviously whatever goes into whatever comes out of the spending review will also be of relevance to the Casey Commission's first phase of work, won't it, Jim? So you kind of want that to be as flexible as possible, really. Oona, anything you wanted to observe?
No, I suppose in that context, it's almost like, you know, looking at the Casey review and the review of social care is distancing itself from the NHS with all the talk about crisis, and actually we know on the ground that they're absolutely intrinsically linked. You know, our two sectors are so linked together, and as a taxpayer, I'm just thinking we're going to be spending more and more money on the NHS when actually the better economy would be to look at the two systems together. So it's unfortunate, isn't it, that we're not going to be that it's going to be so long down the line. Like, absolutely take your point, Liz, about the, you know, the vulnerability of the electoral cycle. Then electoral, it's we can predict it, can't we?
It kind of feels like that. And also, I mean, West Streeting quite regularly talks about the topic of social care being, you know, a kind of death issue in general election campaigning, which, you know, historically, I guess there's some evidence of that. Okay, so we've had a really great scene setter from Natasha. Thank you. So we thought it would be helpful to just explore with a couple of our members kind of what does that mean, really? What are you anticipating the impact of the budget and those increases, particularly around national insurance, but also living wage? What is that going to mean for you as providers of care and support services, the people that work for you, the people that you support, and kind of what's your latest thinking, really? We thought that would be helpful for our audience to hear your perspectives and the things that you're considering or adopting to kind of deal with this situation. So now I'm going to ask Oona to share her thoughts with us.
Thanks, Liz. What I'm going to say is probably everything that you're all going through as providers and sort of decisions and dilemmas that you're facing as well. And I was trying to think how I could be cheerful. So I was trying to get some sort of cheer in what I say now. I'm going to look at two aspects. One is about what the actual implications are for Brunelcare as an organisation. And then I'm going to spin that out and say what I think some of the wider implications are, perhaps some of the things that Natasha didn't mention. So just by way of intro, we're Brunelcare. We've been around for over 80 years, so we predate the NHS. We're a charity and a housing association as well. We provide care homes, hospital discharge, home care, community support, housing, and social housing. So quite a broad range of services for older people that we provide, but quite different to the organisation that Jim runs. So we've got a different perspective. And I've just rather painfully come out of 4 hours this morning of going through my budget for the next financial year. Yeah, I feel quite beaten up actually. It's quite a hard process, and some of the things I'm going to reflect on now are around the things I've actually just been talking about this morning. So hot off the press. Particularly trying to set a budget for next year in the context of not knowing what your commissioned services are going to see in terms of any rate increases is always difficult and happens every year, but it feels particularly difficult this year because of the NI and because of the huge steep rise in that because of the NI. And most local authorities we're trying to talk to are not telling us what sort of range they're looking at. So it's giving us, we're just finger in the air, and I suspect other people on the call today are in the same position. We just don't know, so we're sort of trying to, you know, hope for the best, but perhaps expecting the worst. And we don't blame local authorities for that. We saw, you know, Natasha's slides. Absolutely understand the predicament that they're in. Completely, you know, impossible situation with many of them looking at Section 114s, etc. So anyway, right. So some of the things that we're facing. So our services are all slightly differently impacted. So the services that are particularly vulnerable are home care, our extra care housing, and the care in there, and also our community support. And that's because we've got very few levers that we can pull. So pretty much all the costs in that are in staffing costs. So you can't mess around with that. You have to try and keep some level of differentials. So actually, we've got very little places to go on that. And you could look at, we can look, of course, at reducing our central overheads and our overhead costs, but they're a tiny proportion as well. So actually, there aren't a lot of levers that we can pull in order to make the savings. Second point I wanted to make was about recruitment and retention. So we've really done well, and I think as a sector, we've done really well over the last few years of that awful situation we're in when we had, you know, massive agency use, vacancy rates very high. We're at Brunelcare down to 1% on our vacancy rate at the moment. Really, really good, but that's not accidental. And that's happened because we really invested in T's and C's, looked at how we can move towards parity with the NHS. We're not there, but we're trying to move towards it. And things like pensions, maternity leave, sickness benefits. The budget I started to set this morning has taken all of that out. And I'm really depressed about that. So we're going to have to work really, really hard about keeping our retention and recruitment and not going back to that space we were in a few years ago. The third thing, and this relates to our care home operations, and some of you will be operating care homes, and our bedded reablement services. We do a lot of discharge to assess with commissioned by the ICB, some commissioned by local authorities. Without an 8% increase there, they're not viable. They're just not viable anymore. So we've already started conversations about handing back our contracts for those discharge to assess. And much as we just said in the intro, I mean, that is just mad, isn't it, really? But what are we going to do? How do we get away from corridor nursing if we're actually not being able to take some of that pressure off the NHS? So we're looking at what we have to do in order to do that is switch those commissioned beds into self-funders. We can largely do that, not everywhere, but most places we can do that. It means we'll have a reduced occupancy. But what we found in the last few years when we've had to hand contracts back on ICB type contracts is that they come back to us over the winter months, and actually there's no such thing as winter pressures. It's all year round, really. And so we end up doing spot purchases. It costs more. We can't plan ahead. We can't staff it. It costs the whole system and it costs us as taxpayers more. And I just think that's a mad way to work. And then finally, what we're going to do in terms of meeting the pressures for us at Brunelcare is we're going to be scaling back our modernisation improvement plans. So we'll really be stripping it back to the essential health and safety, of which there are a lot, and our fire safety and all that investment. Even stripping it right back, not doing the modernisation, not, you know, doing the nice things. It does look like we, you know, our bill on fire safety alone is over 3 million. So you've got to do that. There isn't any choice in that. I just move on to talking about what I think from that, looking at from the micro, from us as a sort of micro level, what does that mean for the rest of the system? And if we amalgamate everything that we're doing all together, what I hear from government, from ministers, we're very fortunate in Bristol and we have quite a few cabinet members. Actually, we have Darren Jones, we have Karen Smith, Health Minister, and we have Kerry McCarthy, Dinez Minister. So we have quite a lot of voices, and we're hearing what people are saying. There is an attitude, I think, that we're crying wolf as a sector, and I'm really concerned about that, because I think come April the 1st, will it all look different? Will we all suddenly collapse? No, we didn't during COVID, did we? We'll keep going, and we'll internalise some of that. And we'll look at how can we survive, what can we do, how can we cut away at things. It won't be perhaps for several years that we start to see the impact on that. So, the day one impact won't be the same. I sort of likened it a bit to Brexit. We didn't see Brexit on day one. You see it over years and how it starts to play off in our economy, in the social care economy. Secondly, I think that there will be a rising tide of resentment, actually, from self-funders. I hear it already. So if we're moving from a situation where we have fewer commissioned care, we're in a situation now where 8 years ago, 6 to 8 years ago, we were almost getting parity in terms of self-funders and commissioned care. That has completely gone. And actually, with the increase in national living wage and real living wage over the last 3 years and inflation, we're looking at a gap with our care home beds of about £400 a week between a commissioned bed and a self-funding bed. I think people are getting really angry about that. So I get it from our residents to say, so does this mean that we're cross-subsidising people who aren't paying for their own care? And I say, yeah, it does actually. And I think you have to be honest about that rather than pretending it's not there. And I think that anger and that concern plays to a fundamental, societal thing about fairness. It just doesn't feel fair. It feels like an additional tax on those who are paying for their own care in the first place. And we must remember, paying for their own care means a very low threshold, doesn't it? So, at 23k, it's a very low threshold. And the third, and I've got only 2 more points to make. The third one I was going to make was about consolidation. So when you go through shocks like this in any sort of economy, you get a consolidation. We're a housing association. We've seen it in the housing association sector a lot, consolidation. But I wanted to play out, I think, that idea that one of the things that this government has been quite keen on is how do you keep things, how do you have a local presence? How do you work in your place? How do you have a local place shaping role? Whether that's involvement in things like the integrated care boards or in your neighbourhoods. And I am concerned that if you get a lot of consolidation in the sector, and some of that consolidation, I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm a charity, we're a charity, not for profits. If we are driven out of that space, then that local accountability goes. And I also fear of what we're seeing in the children's sector around out of borough placements and exempt accommodation and that sort of profiteering, perhaps you might call it. I'm really concerned about where that goes if we end up with a very consolidated sector. And then finally, I'm just going to mention about the Employment Rights Bill that Natasha mentioned. Completely support that. This morning, I have taken out all of the things that were moving us towards that in my budget. And I think that's a real shame. And it has to put in doubt our practical reality, unless there's big changes in the comprehensive spending review, fingers crossed, maybe that's my cheerful bit. Unless that happens, we don't have those levers to pull about how we do the things that we really do want to do about better terms and conditions. So I guess, that's I haven't ended on a cheerful note, but I wanted to sort of say that this isn't stuff that is going on in abstract. This is stuff that's going on day to day, and we're all trying to work through the implications of it. And it came left field, and we didn't expect it. Certainly wasn't on my risk map. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Oona. I think that left field point is very interesting as well, isn't it? We always expect an increase in the national living wage. We can there's mood music and there's signals for what that might be, but the employer national insurance contributions I mean, maybe we should have been better with our crystal balls, but we weren't, and the government didn't signal it, and the government really didn't signal it until maybe a couple of weeks before, and even then it was, you know, speculated in by certain bits of the press, and you kind of, you know, there is a bit of a, they would say that, wouldn't they? So thank you for that. I'm sorry you've had 4 hours of budget pain.
Oh, hi.
You look remarkably okay, actually. 4 hours of budget pain. And I think that point about, I guess it's the thing that is mystifying, I think, from kind of sitting outside government is how contradictory the policy statements and ambitions and some of the sort of legislative ambitions are with what you're actually hearing from the Treasury. So the point about the Employment Rights Bill and pay terms and conditions and differentials and doing the things that we all want to do and that the government is going to try and legislate to do, kind of seeing that in the context of an environment created specifically by budget changes, which makes that so much harder. I mean, that is a very frustrating thing. And the other thing that's really frustrating, your point about D2A, discharge to assess, you know, everything that is getting thrown at the NHS to try and fix the problems, you know, we would need a tiny proportion of that actually to support what we do now in terms of that interdependence between health and care for people. I mean, this is about people's experience of trying to get out of hospital or not go in the first place. It's about our neighbours, isn't it? It's about our families. It's about the people that we know and love, and the you know, the experience that we want them to have to not go into hospital unnecessarily, or to be able to get out quickly with the right support to retain their level of independence that they had before they went in. It's so frustrating that for not really very much money more, we could carry on doing what we're doing, or indeed, you know, perhaps with a bit of ambition, we could do a bit more with a bit more money. We don't need like enormous amounts of money. If you think about the 20 odd billion that's going directly to the NHS, you know, 2 or 3 billion of that is actually a pretty small proportion. So what seems really odd is just that disconnect between what the government says it's trying to do, the policy agenda it's pursuing, and the funding and investment decisions it's making. It's bizarre. Jim, from your point of view, any observations from what Oona's told us?
I mean, I was going to talk about some very, very similar things. So I think that'd be my first observation. I think the things that Oona said and that I'll go on to say, I suspect are being felt across most providers. I think the thing of most interest to me is perhaps around this issue of us crying wolf as a sector, and I've certainly heard that from very influential people. And I think the issue with this is that the sector has been salami sliced over a number of years. So, you know, the changes in the budget aren't on the back of a period of grand success and investment for social care. They're on the back of a long and protracted period of underinvestment. And particularly for the people that my charity supports, you know, the aim of the Care Act and the aim of all the reforms and all of the fine words that governments give is to give people, I think the House of Lords in their report called it a gloriously ordinary life. So it's about giving people who from birth have major disadvantages the life that you, I, and perhaps most of the people on the webinar would expect. That can't be done, though, with the funding envelope that's available now, and it certainly can't be done with the funding envelope that will be available next year once these budget impacts hit. So whilst the sector may take a few years, and I agree with Oona, it's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen at some point. Whilst it may take a few years for all of that to come to pass, this salami slicing means that those individuals that need support the most to enable a fulfilling life for them are not getting that support. And actually that at the heart of it is the major issue for me, and I don't think it's acceptable in this country for that to be our position.
Yeah, I think probably most people would agree with you, Jim. And I do think maybe we'll come back to the crying wolf point, actually, because I'm quite interested in views from our participants. I've heard that. I've heard the crying wolf point. You know, you always say there's going to be a catastrophe in the social care sector and you always muddle through. It's never as bad as you say. There's, you know, there's healthy profits being made in some parts of the sector. So, you know, just suck it up, really. And I am interested in how we challenge that narrative, because there's definitely something about how we enable our colleagues in the Department of Health and Social Care to really push back on that. And to try and present the point not as a self-interested load of people who would say that because they run services, but to major on Jim's point, which is what it actually means for people and their families, you know, and your point about unfairness, Oona, and people feeling a sense of real injustice here. You know, there's the injustice in that cross subsidy, and there's the injustice in the salami slicing, and that sense that as a society we should be better. We know it should be better. It should be fairer. It should be better. There's so much unmet need as well as undermet need, and it doesn't have to be that way. And it wouldn't cost an enormous more amount of money to make it different. So perhaps we could think about the crying wolf challenge when we've heard from everybody. I think that's a really interesting point. So, Jim, would you want to give us the perspective from community integrated care about kind of what this means and what you're looking at, really, in terms of very difficult decisions?
Absolutely, will do. Thanks, Liz. So I think maybe it's helpful to start with some context on us as an organisation, particularly the financial context that we're in. So our financial year runs to March, so we're nearing the end of it, and we're currently expecting that we'll make an operating surplus of somewhere around 0.5%, and that's on a total revenue of somewhere in the region of 200 million. So certainly not making obscene profits, I would say, or obscene surpluses. Now that small surplus is after quite a few years of making operating deficits, so relying on our reserves. And I'd like to say it's because we've been fulfilling our mission as a not-for-profit and investing all of that money into new and innovative ways of working and to doing lots of things differently. But actually, similar to what Oona was saying, a part of it at least has been delivered because we're delaying investment in things that we think we should be doing, and that's not a great state to be in. The changes in scope for national insurance and the increase in living wage is going to increase our costs by around about 8%. So unless we receive inflationary uplifts from our commissioners, we will make a deficit next year. So if we were to receive no uplift, we'd make a deficit of about 7.5%, which for us would equate to about 15 million of lost money. We don't fundraise, so we're not a fundraising charity. We don't have any other material sources of income, so that local authority uplift piece is absolutely crucial for our existence. So we work across 99 local authority and ICB areas, so I think we've got a fairly good picture of the country. Some of those are in Scotland, I should say, but it's it's not a hugely different picture there. We've yet to receive firm offers or even indicative offers, in fact, from most of our commissioners. The silence is slightly deafening. But where we have received something, the figures that we're seeing are from 0% in the very worst cases, and there are a few of those, to 5% in the best case. Although, in fact, I think there was one that's coming which is slightly above that, but still doesn't meet the full costs of the statutory cost increases that we're facing. So, not a single commissioner is offering us an uplift at the moment, and the mood music that we're hearing is that that's not going to happen. So we are very much facing into making a deficit. And if it's at the worst case scenario that I said, that will have a terminal effect on us. So at that rate, and with the loss of efficiencies that you'd expect from an organisation that's shrinking, contracting and struggling, we will have exhausted all of our reserves before the Casey review presents its recommendations in 2028. So we won't be there to be reformed. And I suspect others may have joined us as well, because we are a fairly well capitalised charity. What that means is the 2,500 individuals that we support, they're still going to need support, and there is still going to be a cost of supporting them. So all of that cost isn't going to disappear, it's still going to exist. All that's going to be achieved is a huge disruption for those individuals as they're forced to find new providers, in lots of cases find new homes. And of course, there'll be the loss of a charity that's been here for 35 years and I would hope, and I believe, has developed a wealth of experience in delivering supported living services. So clearly, that's not a scenario that we want. So we are going to do a few things differently in the coming year. And the first of those is around pay. So for anyone that knows us, we do an annual campaign called Unfair to Care. We have been major backers of the movement to remove the disparity of pay rates between care and healthcare. So we absolutely back increases in hourly rates. We welcome discussions on fair pay agreements, the Employment Rights Bill, all of that, but it does have to be funded. We, over the last few years, have taken an active decision to focus our investment where we can make it into the hourly rate. So we've increased the hourly rate of our colleagues, and that has had really tangible benefits for us. So we've seen recruitment improved, we've seen retention improved, and we've seen agency use drop. And some of the agency figures are quite stark. There is a very clearly evidenced economic argument for paying our colleagues more. However, because of the changes that we're seeing in next year's budget, around about 1 million that we'd earmarked for investment into the hourly rate is now going to have to be held back. We simply can't afford to spend that money. So that's the first thing that we're going to do. And I've only been the chief executive here for a couple of years. I didn't want to be the chief executive to reduce investment there, but that's the way it has to be. We need to safeguard the charity's future. Secondly, we've already started this. We will be serving notice on a few of our contracts. So we've done some already. There will certainly be more to come. We do hold a number of marginal contracts. And it isn't a decision that we take lightly, because, as I said before, we recognise the disruption that this can have in an individual's life. So many of the people we support have been supported by us for many, many years. And the significant disruption that happens in their lives when we hand back contracts is not something that we would do lightly as a charity. But unfortunately, we are being forced more and more into that position where we have to do that. Third thing that we'll be doing, and just echoing what Oona was saying around change and transformation, we've got quite an ambitious change programme. I don't think it's any secret that social care is perhaps behind the curve when it comes to comparisons with the rest of UK PLC and our use of technology and more efficient ways of working. And we do need to find ways to make the money that's available to us go further. But you can't just magic efficiencies into being. You've got to invest in people, the systems, the processes. All of that requires investment, and we don't think we're going to be able to do the things that we think we need to do over the next few years. So that will be delayed. In some cases, the transformation will be entirely scrapped, and that's just going to put us even further behind the rest of industrial Britain, which again isn't a great place to be. So I didn't want all of this to be doom and gloom, sort of thinking about the crying wolf piece. Really try not to do that, and we are trying to think of things that we can do differently. But as I say, our options are limited. We will work with any of our commissioners to find ways through this wherever possible. One thing we won't do is compromise on service quality, but we do have some technology solutions that we've been developing for a few years that we might be able to deploy in some cases, but it requires real partnership working with commissioners, and I fear that their own capacity for change is also going to be severely limited by the funding challenges that this budget is throwing at them as well. So whilst I say we're always happy to work in partnership with commissioners, it feels like a lot of the détente that was created through and just after the pandemic, where commissioners and providers were perhaps a bit more open with each other, we were communicating better, we were thinking about how we can create joint solutions for the future. That feels like it's really been eroded again as we sit across the virtual table from each other, both trying to balance a budget that simply can't be balanced. You know, we're faced with this impossible situation. And like I say, I don't want to be doom and gloom with it, but as I said before, the inescapable fact of this is that it's vulnerable individuals who are going to be affected by the fallout from all of this. So as I say, people we support, they're placed at an immediate disadvantage. And you know, it's perfectly reasonable for them to expect to lead an ordinary life. And our charitable mission is to try and supplement funded care, which too often is about enabling existence rather than life. So keeps people safe, perhaps keeps them physiologically safe, so meets some of their health needs, although as we see with the health inequalities in learning disabilities, doesn't actually do a great job of that. But it doesn't do too much about community and employment and all of those things that we expect. So that's what we're all about. And these cost pressures make it so much harder to do any of that. And it's not an okay position to be in. It doesn't meet the Care Act. You know, the Care Act has never been properly enacted and funded properly. And it's not a good place to be. So you know, I think, you know, my message for anybody that's listening, and I've said it before, is we simply can't wait for the Casey Commission to come up with whatever it's going to come up with, because that sector may no longer exist, at least not in the form that it currently exists, and which the Casey Commission will shortly be looking at. So that spring spending review is absolutely crucial. So I'll probably leave it there, actually, because I'm in danger of being even more doom and gloom, and maybe we should open it for questions.
Thank you, Jim. And I mean, it is very, very challenging, isn't it? And I think we'll hear a bit from Mel, I think, in a minute about just, I guess, that point around the commissioning partnership, sort of collaborative commissioning versus silos of commissioning. I think it is sometimes it feels inevitable because everybody is in such a difficult bit of the world, aren't they? It's like you get pushed into your box and it's really hard to come out of it and actually have some very frank, honest conversations. I think that can be quite hard for commissioners. I think the other thing is we've lost a lot of commissioning expertise during the pandemic, which I don't think helps us. I was talking to one of our members the other day who runs homelessness services, and it turns out that the commissioners have been been telling her kind of what they want to happen in the services they're commissioning, even down to kind of the number of job roles and what those people should do, as opposed to saying, these are the outcomes I want, this is the volume of outcome that I want, please can you just go and get on with it and be the expert in delivering homelessness and resettlement services. So there's something, I think, about rebuilding that faith that actually we're all in it together to try and do the best for the people that we're supporting. And actually, as providers, we've probably got some real expertise that is underestimated, perhaps by our commissioners who don't have that level of experience, perhaps, because they've not been doing it for that long, you know, and the pandemic would have been a baptism of fire, I'd have thought, for lots of people. So I think that point about trying to think creatively together in very challenging financial circumstances is key. But I guess when you spoke, when the minister was there, were you able to kind of convey that anxiety about the Casey Commission being 3 years after everyone's shut up shop?
I did, yeah. I was fortunate enough to be able to ask him a direct question, and I'll tread carefully because I'd never want to put words in somebody's mouth. But what was very clear for me, at least, was that there is no more funding available from the Treasury for the next 12 months. We're on our own in this, and I think he said, you know, he appreciates that the national insurance changes may be difficult, but nobody's got a better plan and they're necessary. And that's kind of where it stopped. My sense is very much that when people talk about the crying wolf issue in particular, that is a Treasury-led discussion. I think when you get into you know, people who understand the sector, people in the DHSC and commissioners, I think a lot of that does tend to fall away when the realities are understood. But the overwhelming sense from the session is that, you know, recognise that this is all very, very hard, but nothing's going to change imminently.
Okay, I mean, I am you know, you've got to be an optimist, haven't you, to work in this bit of the world? And you know, there are political decisions. Political decisions are being made. They are ultimate, you know, and notwithstanding everything that we've heard about the management of the economy and the black holes, political decisions are being made. And there, in my view, and in my experience, actually, there is always an opportunity to make a change to political decisions. It's just how you help people to do that. So I think that there's a very lovely comment in the Q&A saying the desperateness of this conversation is heartbreaking. And I'm sending love and strength to us all. I would add to that actually this is a political matter. You know, there are political decisions being made, and it's clear that political prioritisation is being given to the NHS over and above social care. And there is a different decision to be made. And it doesn't have to be a competing decision. It can be a both and decision, I think, from just listening to everything that you've said, Jim. Oona, did you want to?
I was going to jump in on that. I think you're absolutely right. It is a political decision, and that's about how much political noise there is as well around the issue. And it's interesting in the systems that we're working in, actually the noise is coming from the hospitals, less the ICB actually, but from the acute hospitals. They're saying we need social care, and they're setting up partnerships and coming out to communities and coming out to the voluntary sector to say we you know, we need you, we need a different way, we need to, if we're going to be delivering, you know, the maxims about from sickness to prevention, from hospital to community and all the rest of it, then actually it has to be done with us. So I think it is about that political voice. And I was going to, you know, Mel's on the call, she's going to speak next. And we work in Somerset very well with you, Mel, I hope you would agree. But and it's not about Somerset particularly this, but in the other local authorities we work in, rather than that collaborative, this is us, we're in all of this together, this is a political issue, and we need to join forces on that, we're still getting a little bit of that tired, we're paying more than anybody else in the country sort of narrative, and, you know, the rates we pay are very reasonable. And actually, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a step change and a difference that has to be recognised, and just getting sort of like us to that or almost introspective look at rates and fees is missing the bigger point, I think, and that bigger political issue that you mentioned.
Yeah, and I know I know it's challenging, you know, there are layers of politics with it all, aren't there? And how much you're seen to be challenging the government, the new government, if you're a local authority of a particular colour, political colour, that can bring its complexities. It's a challenge for our leaders and our portfolio holders. But the assumption, I think, I am reading between the lines, but the assumption appears to be from the Treasury decision making is that there is much less political capital in social care, and therefore you're not sacrificing it by not supporting it.
Mm.
Whereas there's a lot of political capital in relation to decisions about the NHS.
Mm.
And that, I think, is potentially the thing that we can change, really. Natasha, you've hopped on.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I think you've hit something there, Liz, about the invisibility of social care, that makes this really difficult, because the NHS crisis is much more visible. You know, you can see the ambulances queuing around the block. You can take photos of A&E and splash them on the front page of the newspaper. A lot of the crisis in social care is behind private home, you know, your front door. And so making the case to the Treasury is much more difficult, I think. And we all understand the moral case, but what's the financial case? And just thinking about, I think the Treasury needs to understand social care as a case for investment. So we can't have a functioning economy, we can't have a functioning society or a functioning NHS without a decent social care system where people are supported to live the lives they want to lead. And so I think that's the narrative that we need to get to, is about, how do we support people to live well, to get into work, to support unpaid carers, to support people in, not going into hospital, coming out of hospital, and thinking about how we make that case for the sector and getting the narrative into that space.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I'm just writing an article to that effect. And of the government's 5 stated missions, economic growth, tick, you need social care. Building an NHS fit for the future, tick, you need social care. And enabling, removing barriers to opportunity, which is actually focused on children and young people, but tick, you need social care. I could probably push it for making Britain a green energy superpower, and I can't remember what the 5th one was. But out of those 3 missions, social care is an intrinsic part. And all the worry about having nearly 10 million people out of the labour market, social care is an intrinsic part. It's just, I don't, I mean, maybe I've just been in an echo chamber for too long, and I just, find myself saying the same things, and people I talk to go, yeah, that sounds sensible. Right, I'm going to bring Mel in, because I'm sure Mel's heard a lot of this locally, and the role of the DASS is an unenviable role in many ways, and Mel is going to explain to us how it looks from her point of view, and kind of, I guess, some observations for us, really, Mel, because you're doing the doing at the coalface, and interestingly, you've got the care and housing angle as well as that national use of resources angle. So no doubt you've got colleagues up and down the country who are kind of in the middle of all of this, looking at what's happening in their local authority finance world, what's happening in their provider, care and support provider world, what's happening in their health world and their housing world, and thinking, okay, we've got to find a way to navigate it. So some observations. I'm not expecting you to have all the answers, but I just think that perspective of what local authorities have got to try and juggle, and kind of ways in which they might do that more creatively or innovatively, or not. We've heard some not, so it'd be great to hear some yes doing.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. And actually, the DASS role is a pleasure to have, if I'm honest with you. It's tough at times, but really, it means you should be able to influence and support wherever necessary. So if I think about, and I'm going to start us from a national position rather than my local position to start with, because as part of my use of resources, I am meeting with Treasury. I am meeting collectively from an ADASS point of view with the Department of Health and Social Care, with MHCLG on a very regular basis. From an ADASS, Association of Directors of Adult Services point of view, along with the LGA, Local Government Association, and partners in health and care, we have been meeting really regularly together. And we've been thinking through, how can we use our voices to influence the spending review? How can we help providers and listening to providers to actually bring those messagings across? Because you're right, we can't do it without you, and we are in this together. And I think the challenge is, how are we collectively sharing our voices together rather than one against each other. And I don't think that's where we are, one against each other, because we can only do this if we're together in that sector. And I know ADASS has linked in with all sorts of providers and helped together to share that voice. So we are all hopefully sharing the voice together. But I'm not hearing that there's lots of money, and none of us are. So we are in a position where we've got to think, okay, so what's our creative solutions for delivering? And I'm really sorry if you're not being spoken to be about what your possible uplift could be. They probably can't, well, they won't be able to tell you it is this, but what they will be able to say is it may be in the range of this, because as you'll know, local government have to go through a political cycle to get our budgets signed off. So just before I came in here, I was in scrutiny, talking through possible uplifts, talking through budget, talking through deficits, talking through us as a council of where we were. And every council in the country will be doing that at this moment to hopefully sign off eventually at full council in the end of February. Some have got dates going into March. So we won't know our budget settlement until that time, because obviously that's a political decision. But I suppose if I think about what's been said so far, and I just give you a bit of background on where we are as councils across the total. So local government settlement, it didn't provide us with sufficient resources to meet all the pressures. And I think that's a given. We haven't got the money to be able to do that. And interestingly, although the rhetoric out there is health have got lots of money, if you talk to your local ICB or your ICB, they will say, God, it's as tough here. It's actually a flat budget. And they are talking through it's a flat budget. So if they want to put any increases, they're going to have to make a saving somewhere else. And that's the challenge for your ICBs as much as it is for our local government. So they don't even know yet, or late last week, and I don't know if they've had their settlement. They don't even know what their settlement is yet. So they have not been told yet what their budgets are for next year. They haven't had that for each ICB. They may have had it yesterday, but I haven't spoken to them yesterday, but they hadn't had it. So it's really difficult for them to think about what they can do and how they can go forward. So there is a challenge for our ICBs as much as there is for ourselves. And it is actually about how we all, three of us, work together, both our ICBs from a commissioning point of view, ourselves as local government, and and yourselves and the market out there. So we're going to have to think through how are we getting better at doing this. So as we said, we've been given the 2% precept. Most councils, I think, will give that. If I give you an example, the 2% precept in Somerset is circa 7 million, roughly that. Out of the 880 million that was given to on top of this around an adult social care increase, and that was 800, so they did up it by 80. That's going to be we're about 1% of everything. So take that in, about 8.8 million. Interestingly, if you think about it, that is split between children and adults. And last year, you're absolutely right, it was about a 60-40% split. I'm not convinced it'll be that this year, because most of you will know that children's services overspend is growing up and up and up because of that market, and because it's a very national market and people are charging an awful lot to support children. They come over to adults and we change the way in which we do it. But that isn't the markets, that's about the market and the price of care in the market. So I can see that split. So if you think about that, that's another 8.8 million. I'm lucky if I'm going to get 4 million of that. So 7 and 4, 11 million. That would not touch the sides of me giving an uplift of, and I think we can probably say, if we were going to look at pressures in the market, underlying costs for providers, ignoring national insurance, we're working out nationally, so, and you may challenge me on this one, but it's about 5.5%. And then if we were going to put national insurance on that, around 8%-ish. Maybe 10% if you've got an awful lot of part-time staff, but around 8%. That amount of money will not enable me to get anywhere close to that. And I think most authorities are in that same space, because we've got to build in for demography. We've got to build in for everything we're doing. Most local councils in their adult social care services will also be being asked for savings, because we have to make savings year on year to manage the whole spend. We haven't been given any new money. Actually, Somerset got less money this year than was expected because they took away the rural grant. And didn't give us any, and a couple of other grants, and didn't give us any money in terms of deprivation. So they looked at the financial settlement, they looked at the way they did it. In order for them to give some money for deprivation, they took that out of some local councils around their rurality. So councils are in a not very good position. We've been using reserves across the whole country for a while. So, you know, I can go doom and gloom here, or I can say, okay, so what are we going to do differently? What can we do? What can we do together? There are a couple of areas I think that we can start working better on together. And one of the things that I've got a conversation with Treasury of on I think it's around the 8th, I'm going to somewhere in that date, beginning of February, is around what they're asking for is what prevention things can you do that we could give you money for? And what is that then saves you money further down the line? So if you have got loads of really good ideas in place that are costed, because there's no point me going to Treasury without saying, if you give me this amount of money, invest to save, this is the savings we can make, even if it's next year or the year after. I think that's a real challenge for us. So I think in terms of AI, in terms of prevention, early intervention, use of digital, anything in that space, I think there is probably a will to do that. You'll also know they gave us DFG money. And I think although we can be a little bit more creative at how we use our disability facilities grant money, and could we, question mark, and I can, you know, I can't know if everybody will, but I'm sure we can think about how we could use that slightly differently for some different models of delivery. I think there's ways in which we can use that for tech and tech-enabled care in its widest sense. So I think there's some possibilities there. I think we just need to sit down together and work that through. I think it's really challenging. In the last 2 years, cost of care has grown. And interestingly, although we're not putting the percentage up much, nationally, it's suggesting that cost of care has grown significantly higher than the underlying inflation. So we know that because actually I'm paying more. So the suggested cost of care is likely to increase by 10% next year, but it will, because you're going to charge me more, even though I can't fund it. However, the challenge will come back and say, we'll be saying back to you, well, we can't fund it either, and we'll either be more overspend. That means we're going to have to cut more services to be delivering. So it's a real chicken and egg in that space. I think, you know, we're going to have to together think about those new models of care. What does it look like? What do we have out there? How is housing and care linked together? The Treasury are thinking through on capital. And is there a way in which we can use capital in this space? So is there a way in which we can use capital differently? We know from a local government point of view, from transformation, we can use capital money to do transformation. That's an okay thing to do. We can do that on in the way that we work. So I think there are ways in which we can try and work differently, but it's going to be tough, and I absolutely understand that and recognise that across the piece. Reablement offers and community reablement, it's got to be the way forward. And I think if we're working with our health, if we look at the NHS 10-year plan, it is all about community. So I think we're going to have to work with our ICBs, work with our acute and community trusts, and start working with them about what is the possible, what is the art of the future, how are we doing this together? Because I think those new ways of working will help. I suppose the other challenge for all of us is around those self-funded markets. So of course, I will be saying to you all, well, can you put a bit more on your self-funders, please? Can you do that? Because I don't know how else we're going to survive together. The challenge with that is, and I can see it day in, day out, more people have depleted funds and then they come back to the local authority. So from just a Somerset point of view, it's circa numbers, because I'm not going to give you exact, but about 40 people per month come back in to the local authority because of depleted funds. That has grown by 25% in the last year. and in the year before that, about 15 to 18%. So we're seeing that because you're putting the costs on there, absolutely, because you've got no other choice, but it comes in. And for people then, we're often moving people because we can't afford the fee price that they're paying. We're trying to find somewhere else with the fee price. And that is rubbish. And that's not where we want to be. So it is tough. It's tough for you. It's tough for us. But the only way we're going to get through this is by working together and by commissioning together. So the Registered Care Provider Association in Somerset probably does know, because I've had a conversation with them. They know roughly where I'm likely to get to. And then I know it's not enough for anybody. So the only way we're going to do this is by saying actually how we're going to do it. And it may take us 1 or 2 years to get there. We can't take any longer. So I think there is for us, how do we do that? The crime wolf thing's interesting. I absolutely believe Treasury think that. And what they've asked for is, well, how are you going to tell us? So we'll look at the data on a regular basis. I said, that's not going to show you it. So they say, oh, well, we'll look at how many handbacks you have. You'll love the forms that we have to fill in. We'll look at how many handbacks you'll have. We'll look how many, and I said, that's just far too late. But actually, I think if we could think of a way together of actually sharing the information, they will only go if we've got data. As you know, I love stories and I can tell them all the stories in the world, but what they'll want to see is this is the evidence and this is the data. They also like to hear, well, how can you solve this? How can we solve it? What are the solutions? So I think when we're talking to anybody, it's this is the data. If we do this differently, this is where we'll get to. And more importantly, these are some of your solutions. And I think that's the only way we can do it that fits in with their tech, that fits in because they're into tech, they're into AI, they're into, you know, let's hit the points that hit them. And I think that's where I'd go. But it's not easy. And, you know, I thank you so much for all the work that you do. So from a commissioner to you, I really do, because without you, we wouldn't be where we are today. And that doesn't matter whether that's a learning disability service or people for working age or our older population. And I do struggle sometimes because the rhetoric out there is our older population. Half of my money is spent on working age, on people with a learning disability, etc. And it's really important that we also push that up the answers, up the questions and into government mind. And I think the latest piece of work that's gone on around working age and around learning disability that one of our consultancy organisations have done at least starts to challenge that and challenge that rhetoric. I'll stop there for a minute.
Thank you, Mel. And yes, I mean, I really agree with you that we're all in it together and we're all trying to get to the same outcome, aren't we? Which is, you know, good quality, cost-effective services. I'm interested actually in the children's social care point, because we've been watching with interest what's happening in Wales, which is seeking to eliminate profit from children's social care, and that seems quite challenging. But I think there is a sense that the children's social care market is much more exploitative in terms of costs than the adults one. And I wonder whether that is actually how it's going to pan out. But that's a really, you know, that's a very helpful point. So I've been looking a bit at, well, actually, but before I go and just reflect on some things in the chat, does anybody want to make any observations about what Mel said? Because there's a few thoughts occurred to me, but I'm quite interested in any responses from listening to Mel. Observations, thoughts? Natasha?
Sorry.
Oh, Oona?
Okay.
Go,
No,
Oona.
I'm glad you are talking to Treasury, Mel, and if you want some of that data, come back to us, because I guess we're making those decisions. You know, it's not necessarily in Somerset, but for Jim and for us, we're making decisions now about not investing in AI, not investing in technology, you know, not doing some of that stuff, handing back. So actually we are having those conversations, but we haven't got a conduit, if you like, to get that through to Treasury. So we can definitely work with you on that.
So please use me, and I will use ADASS in that space. So I think if anything we've got, and sooner rather than later, is great, because we've not got long. So I think anything anybody has got that they want to share, please do that, because I think that, and it's the real data we require. So I think, you know, if Liz and them can get that information, we can start pulling that together pretty quickly. It's just the evidence we need to be able to share with people.
When you say real data, I mean,
Well,
we've put data together for Treasury and they haven't, well, actually, that's not true. We've put data together for DHSC to give to Treasury and they've told us it's not good enough because it doesn't have the magic thing that says, well, if you spend this, you'll definitely save that. And it's true that we might save that, but actually that is a whole bundle of costs that sit across loads of government departments, and Treasury don't believe that will be realised.
I think what I'm saying is so all I had a good conversation about. She's been in budgets all for 4 hours today, whatever it was, and actually this is what they are going to have to stop to be able to survive. I think it's some of that information that we can start sharing, because that starts telling us, you know, Jim talked about quality of life, and absolutely, to live your best life, it's not a huge ask. It's just perhaps what I do and others do every day. So what does that mean for people? Does that mean actually people aren't now going to be able to get into employment, people with a learning disability? Does it mean those sorts of things, that we're cutting that sort of service? And therefore, how does that affect the economy? We have to click on what Treasury, what's important to Treasury. We have to hook on the things that they're thinking about. And I think that's the only way we can do this, because they're not going to, you know, I can tell a lovely story, but actually I need the evidence that sits around it. If we're thinking about prevention, what have we done early on? So a really good example of prevention, I think North Somerset have done a piece of work, really basic stuff in our care homes, of looking at rehydration and tools they've used to do rehydration. Actually, if you look at that data, it stopped so many people going into hospital, and they've got that information. So it's actually some of those stories about what tech-enabled care you're using, which stops people either going into an acute setting, because we have to hit the things that they're worried about, and that is admissions to hospital, discharges from hospital. It's that, and
Yeah.
when I say data, it's that sort of, so this does this,
Okay.
consequences.
That's really interesting. So we have been talking to the department about how they might gather information on potential contract handbacks.
Yeah.
Which is a very, as you've just explained. So having worked in a local authority, I know the nightmare of trying to get your decisions through everybody, ready for either February or March cabinet or whatever your model is, and everything that goes into that. Having done all your consultation about budget proposals over Christmas, and doing the ward rounds with councillors, God, we've all got the scars, haven't we? To say this is what it's going to mean for you living here. So I totally get that. But so asking providers now what they're planning to hand back based on a not good enough fee uplift is an impossible question for anybody to answer.
Yeah.
Because no one can tell you what your possible fee uplift is going to be. We haven't had the final local government settlement, and we haven't had the local decision-making processes in individual authorities.
No, but
what we can do is say, this is what, based on our best guess, this is what we're going to not do.
I think that's the bit.
Yeah.
You know, Jim talked about from 0 to, I think you talked to just over 5%. You know, just think you're going to be in that region, and I think go worst case scenario, you know, up. And your local registered care provider association will probably, if they're, so I've sat and talked to them, my commissioners have sat and talked to them, they know roughly where I'm going to be.
Yeah.
So it's worth having a conversation in those spaces if you've got those in your area.
So let me just see if anybody else wants to say anything. Jim, was there anything you wanted to say, Jim, in response to that?
What was I going? Yeah, there was. I think the point around evidence is well made. We've done some of our own engagement with the Treasury off the back of our Unfair to Care report, trying to explain the benefit of investing in frontline pay. I think anything that we can do as a sector which enhances the picture for people is going to be really important. I think the one thing though that we really need to find a way of demonstrating is the double running costs of change. So we're all driving our organisations down the motorway at 70 miles an hour, and we're flat out just trying to get to a destination. to deliver all of this change that's required to work more innovatively, to do things differently, to be more efficient, we're having to make modifications to that car, but we can't stop providing services. So we have to find a way of doing it whilst we're still going, hell for leather. And that costs money. There is no way around it. You need to be able to invest in delivering change in an organisation that can't stop and pause what it's doing. So we need to be able to get that very clearly understood by the Treasury, that there is a willingness to do things differently. There is a willingness to be more efficient, to find better ways of doing stuff across the entirety of the sector. But it has to be enabled in some way. We can't do this on our own. We can come up with ideas, we can come up with plans, but we have to be funded properly to deliver it.
Yeah, and I agree, Jim. And I think that point about tech-enabled care, I mean, at the NCF, we do loads and loads of stuff in the innovation space, and particularly in the digital innovation space. And I am very confident that technology will bring us certain solutions, because we're simply not going to have the workforce to do the things that we need to do. We're going to have to find different ways of using technology and innovation to empower people, to give them more choice and control over how they get their care and support. And we're going to have to use it to make sure that we are using our people power in a way that harnesses the best things about that and doesn't kind of absorb time doing non-people power things, if you see what I mean. So I really do believe that tech is as a solution, but of course you've got to be able to invest in it. So that is a challenge for us, isn't it? At a time when we're thinking, okay, our investment plans are on ice. And I was just reflecting on some of Mel's points about the DFG, and also was thinking about the Better Care Fund. And I just wonder whether there is a way. The Better Care Fund is supposed to be being reviewed or having a new policy statement. And there's a lot of money in the Better Care Fund. So just thinking about that kind of reablement challenge and that discharge challenge, I wonder whether there is something in that, in how the Better Care Fund is used to support some of the ambitions of the government, well, and all of us, but stated ambitions in recent policy documents about speeding up discharge and reducing admission. Any inspiration about the Better Care Fund, Mel? Anything we could be doing there?
So Better Care Fund, they think it's going to be, well, I don't think there's any uplifting this year. Certainly no uplift in the local government one. We're still waiting to hear if Health have got any uplift in theirs, but I'm not holding my breath. So what you find is it's probably all spent. However, and I think the golden nugget in this space is if we can stop doing some of the stuff that probably isn't making the best use of that funding and do that differently, I think there's some light in the end of the tunnel. They are absolutely changing the way in which it's going to be. They're taking some of the constraints off it, and I think that can only benefit where we're going to get to with it. It'll take us a little time because you're going to have to do a bit of double running as you talk about everything else, but I think that is an area that creatively, probably not in next 6 months time, but actually a bit later on, that we might be able to use differently. So if we can, I bet you, if you look at how much out of the Better Care is spent on discharge, it'll be massive. And is that all doing the right things?
Right thing.
In acute and others. So I think there is something in that space.
Yeah. And I'm just popping back to the chat. Somebody's asked about the role that the CQC should be playing. Yeah, that's a good, the role they should be playing to oversee the financial viability of all providers. I think that is a question, actually. I don't know how much providers would welcome it, those who are in the market oversight regime at the moment, if that was broadened. But there's a risk of big providers, but there's also a risk of lots of smaller providers collectively not being able to continue to do what they do. And there's also the CQC's responsibility as a champion and advocate for the sector as well. And they do know that. And I think they're doing some things behind the scenes, potentially. Let me just have a little while. I realise we're
on that.
Yes,
Liz.
of course,
I think
Natasha.
there is a great potential for the CQC to play a greater role and to play more of an improvement supportive role. And I think the financial management regime has been a bit underpowered and very focused on the bigger providers, but I think they will need to shift, because I think, as colleagues have said, the impact of the financial pressures now will be, on the smaller providers, a very slow burn, sort of, collapse or withdrawal.
Yeah.
So I think there is potential if the CQC is, bolstered and shifts its focus. So I think if we can influence that process and their thinking as well, I think that's another way, a way in.
Thank you. Well, I realise we're at time, and I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for a very, very helpful, reflective discussion. I've taken some key points from our discussion. There's some good ideas about the crying wolf point, and actually, I think Mel's point about keeping it simple and just telling people what we're going to stop doing might be a really powerful thing. It's just how we get a volume of information. So back to my spending review point, actually the spending review is a real opportunity to say, what are you going to stop doing as a result of the employer NICS stuff? There is a link. We can share a link if it hasn't already gone anywhere as to how you, it was on Natasha's slides as to how you submit to the spending review. So I think probably my immediate call to action for everybody who's listened is get something into the spending review about what you're going to stop doing as a direct result of the employer NICS increases. And then let us think a bit more creatively about how we inspire other authorities to take the view that Mel's given us so clearly, which is we're in it together, we've got to do it together. We're not going to each have the solutions, but if we work together on finding ways through, that is much more likely to deliver better outcomes for our communities than each of us sitting in a dark room trying to work it out. So any other final reflections before we wrap up? No? Okay. Only 2 minutes over. I will say a big, massive thank you to you all. Thank you to everybody who came and listened, and thanks to CMM for hosting and organising and getting it all together.